you. Ladies and gentlemen, today's concert reflects the kind of music that people would have played in their homes in the 1790s, 1800s. In order to understand something about musical life in London during this period, we need to look back really to the early 18th century and the 17th century to see how basically musical life had evolved. In the Renaissance, during the Renaissance, obviously music became a very important part of court life, and even in the British court, Henry VIII's court, for example, there was much music making, and you had composers such as Tallis writing music for the Chapel Royal. These musicians, in fact, most of the musicians of that time, what we would now call, I suppose, professional musicians, were brought up in the cathedral tradition, which still goes on to this day across the country. And they would have started out as choristers, and there was a general assumption that if your son went into a choir, he would would sing as a man in that choir, and if he played an instrument, he would probably become a professional musician. So in a way, it was a kind of ecclesiastical apprenticeship into the music profession. For instrumentalists, during this period, it was a different kind of ball game. Music was played in the home, but the idea of public concerts didn't really emerge until the end of the 1600s. And we find that the first public concert hall in Britain was actually just off the Strand in York Buildings, and that was built in 1680. And that was the first concert hall that was open to the general public. If people wanted to go and hear a concert, they would hear it if the king invited them, or if a particular noble in an aristocratic family had an interest in music, they might have a little concert in their house. But the idea of people rocking up and listening to a concert didn't really exist until 1680 onwards. And then we see a kind of big explosion of music making and concerts from 1680 onwards. But where did these people train? One of the clues in today's concert is a marvellous piece by John Field. It's a nocturne. John Field was an Irishman. He was an incredibly talented musician as a young boy, and his father paid for John Field to be an apprentice to Clementi, who was an Italian composer living in London. Clementi was, like many musicians of this time, was very entrepreneurial. Not only did he write music, he performed his own music, he also owned a piano shop and had a company that made pianos. So there was a whole lot of things going on there with Clementi, and Field was Clementi's assistant. And so, consequently, after a long apprenticeship, Field became a virtuoso pianist. But this was something that probably extends right back into the medieval idea of apprenticeships and guilds. And with music, this was the same as studying any other type of trade. And John Field is a key example of that. And his father would have had to have given Clementi a sum of money in order to feed him and train him the trade of playing the piano and writing music. And obviously Field would have had to have copied Clementi's music and would have had to have helped Clementi as a sort of servant type figure. Field went on to become one of the great virtuoso pianists of the early 19th century. And as you hear from this nocturne today, his music bridges the gap between Beethoven, the sonatas of Beethoven, and Chopin. And Chopin and Liszt both revered Field's music because they saw him as one of the key figures in the early Romantic movement, which obviously led to the kind of cult of the virtuoso performer, and Field was one of those figures. When he was a little bit older, after he'd finished his apprenticeship, he actually travelled very widely performing. He actually ended up in St. Petersburg working there. And what is so interesting about many of the musicians from this period is it's a very international scene. Many of the musicians that were working in London were from Italy or from France. Dussek, who was Czech, and also Viotti, who was Italian, both ended up in London in 1789 because they worked for Marie Antoinette's court. So they had to leave, and they came here and made money giving concerts in London. Dussek is a great concert pianist, and Viotti is a great violinist. He was actually thrown out of Britain in 1798 for being a Jacobite. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. And he gave up the violin and became a wine merchant, so there must be some kind of moral into that story. But having said that, Viotti was a great figure in France. He really established the French school of violin playing. What we don't have in this period is really a system of conservatories and a professional training for musicians. What we have is a kind of apprenticeship system which goes very far back, right back into the Middle Ages. In London, the first professional place to study music was the Royal Academy of Music in 1822. And reading back through some literature, Gresham College, in fact, was in 1597, was the first place in London to have a professor of music, which was John Bull. And people would have heard him talk about music. Having said that, looking through the list of professors after that, very few of them until the 19th century were actually musicians. And this was because the training in the Inns of Court, which were effectively like the third university in Britain, you had Oxford and Cambridge during this period, and the Inns of Court, and obviously Gresham College, which was way before London University was thought of. And as part of the sort of humanist training for the legal profession, they were expected to learn to know about music and the arts and be generally well-rounded. So this is quite an interesting thing. So maybe many of the musicians that played music in this part of town, possibly in their own homes or elsewhere, or went to concerts, were people that had kind of been brought up with music through that kind of background, rather than some kind of academic training or through some kind of vocational training. And what we see in the 19th century is an emergence largely fueled on this incredible growth in concert giving during the 18th century. In the 19th century, we see a professionalization of music and a much bigger kind of input from institutions, and many more people gaining access to music in concerts, and also through mass publishing, being able to pick up the latest Haydn quartet or the latest Mozart piano quartet or the latest Dussek volume of piano trios, so that they could play them in their own homes. One of the pieces on today's programme is by a composer called Onslow. Now, he's an interesting figure because his father was the Duke of Onslow, who was kicked out of Britain for having a homosexual affair. And Onslow was very wealthy. He didn't have to earn a living as a musician. But nevertheless, his music enjoyed a lot of popularity in the early 1800s. He was a pupil of Dussek, and obviously was a good pianist. But this particular movement that we're playing today is typical of the type of music that would be easily playable by an amateur musician in their own homes. You'll notice that the part writing isn't particularly complicated. It's quite lively and entertaining music, but there are no great harmonic developments, or there's no feeling that he's trying to break the boundaries of how music is perceived during this period. The Mozart G minor piano quartet, which was written in 1785, so earlier, is the first piano quartet, one of the first piano quartets ever written. What's interesting about this piece is that there's a real interplay between the instruments. You'll hear the tunes equally passing between all the instruments. It's not like a violin versus everybody else. It's a very sort of equal dynamic going on. And this was something that really Mozart and Haydn achieved very early on in the 18th century with their compositions. And this was one of the things that really distinguished the music that they composed and a lot of the other music from this time. There's a real liberation of the instruments. And by the time you get to late Haydn and certainly mid to late Beethoven, you find that pieces are too complicated for people to play in their own homes. If you take late Beethoven string quartet like Opus 127, people still struggle to play this sort of music now. So back then, it would have been like some kind of musical Esperanto to most musicians. which is possibly why they were not so successful during Beethoven's lifetime. People knew about them, and obviously the music had a profound influence over a lot of composers during the 19th century and the 20th century, but they weren't necessarily performed. But what we have here, the music that you'll hear tonight, is music that would have been performed a lot and was readily performed in people's houses. One of the things that, going back to the London scene, London became a mecca for musicians from across Europe, largely because of revolutions that were going on in the various capitals of Europe, particularly in Paris and Vienna as well, later with Napoleon. People came here, but also it was possible here to make a fortune as a musician. I think I mentioned in the first talk that Haydn managed to earn in his first stay here the equivalent of 10 years' salary, just with 1 year's work. And it basically provided him with a house, because he didn't own a house. He was able to buy a house in Vienna when he moved back. And it also effectively gave him a pension, so he was sort of didn't really have to worry so much about where his next paycheck was coming from. And this kind of attitude towards music and music making meant that publishing became very important. And London became the centre, really, of publishing for many European composers. So Beethoven, Haydn, Dussek, Viotti, they all had their music published here, and it was readily available for people to play. And it's quite interesting because many of the things that we see emerging during this time are things that are still resonating with us now, because London is still the music publishing capital of Europe in many respects, and many of the companies that were established then have been bought out and have developed and are still with us. Moving back to the idea of the public concert, one of the reasons why the concerts began to become successful was there was a real attempt to draw in an audience that was going to the theatre. Now, the theatre was very popular, opera was very popular. So what these entrepreneurs did, like Salomon, was they would put on a couple of singers. So you'd have a concert where there would be a few opera arias, and there might be a symphony, a bit of a violin concerto. There were lots of breaks. People would have talked, they would have smoked, they would have eaten and drank while they were listening to music, or not listening to it, as the case may be. And so they really tried to compete with the theatre, and what you find after this period from 1680 onwards, you find that concerts become very popular events, and they kind of compete with the theatre. In fact, they even put them at the same time as the theatre to deliberately provoke. And it was a very entrepreneurial spirit that these concerts were generated at the Hanover Rooms, the York Buildings, the Hickford concert series, which went on, and you gradually find that after 40 years, one becomes unpopular and something else becomes unpopular. But it was a real development of popular concert going, and this fed very much into people's music making in their homes. And Haydn, just to give some kind of idea of the proof of this, by the time Haydn came to London, he was world famous, so everybody knew who he was. People used to come up to him in the street and say hello. So people did know about him, even although we were living in a world with very different kind of communications to the world we live in today. And he really was universally feted, not just by aristocracy, but he was known by ordinary people because they went along to the concerts too if they could. What makes this easier in a way, and you'll hear this tonight, is that there's a kind of musical vernacular during this period. There's a style that people can readily appreciate, based around melody and harmony. Much of the music is very charming. It's not trying to be thought-provoking, a lot of it. And in fact, the songs that you'll hear today are folk songs, again, deliberately targeted for amateurs to play at home. They're Scottish tunes and English folk songs, arranged for piano trio, so you can invite a few of your friends around. And they could be sung by anybody. They're short, they're fairly easy to put together, but they're exactly the kind of volumes that composers like Beethoven would publish to make a bit of extra money, and for people to go away and play it and think, oh, I played some Beethoven last night, when actually they were playing Sally in My Alley. So this is tonight's concert represents the sort of music that would have been heard and would have been appreciated at home. The G minor piano quartet, I think, is particularly special, and it's the last piece on our programme. This really is one of Mozart's great chamber works, and you can hear in this piece the real essence of his greatness as a composer. You'll hear flashes of this kind of thing in the Onslow. Some of the counterpoint in the Onslow sounds a little bit like Mozart or Haydn, but Mozart is able to take it onto a different level to pretty much anyone else. And it's the same when you listen to Haydn's chamber music and Beethoven's chamber music too. G minor is a particularly important key for Mozart, and it's linked with tragedy or fate. The 40th Symphony is in G minor, one of his greatest symphonies. And what you find in this piece is an incredible strength, not just in the writing for the piano, but also in the writing for strings. And it's a very beautiful and moving piece. And what you can perhaps listen out for is how composers from this period are really trying to combine lots of different musical elements. If you go back to the Baroque period, a composer would write a gavotte or a minuet, and it would be one mood, it would be one type of piece, one type of tune, if you like. But what the composers in the classical period are doing is taking all these different types of music and putting them together in a new way. So you'll hear bits that sound like opera, like recitative. The slow movement might sound like an aria that could come from any of the operas. You might have some fugue. It sounds slightly academic, but Mozart operas have fugues in. It's putting all these different elements together into one piece. And that's what is so interesting and fascinating about this period, how there is a real proliferation of music and music making going on in the 1790s, 1800s in London. And it's something that was rooted really right the way through that 18th century. And also, if you think about it, it has parallels with the way that London was developing as a world centre during this time. There was a huge amount of building that went on in that century before the Industrial Revolution. And you see an emergence of a middle class of people who want to learn, people who want to better themselves through becoming more cultured with the arts and reading and doing things. And that's why this is such a timely talk with Gresham setting up this college, because he really was to insist on someone to lecture on music in 1597 was quite an unusual thing to do. But the actual principle is the same, trying to encourage the general public to understand about music. And really, these public concerts, the advent of publishing, all these things are coming together during this period to make the music of the day, if you like, as widely available as possible. And that's a very different scenario to what we have now, where contemporary music is very much on the margins of what people listen to. So it's a very different time. And these composers, like Haydn and Mozart, were generally the X-factor stars of the 18th century. Thank you very much.
it too, my honey. And would it were £1,000, I'd give it all to Sally. She is the darling of my heart, and she lives in a alley. My master and the neighbors all make game of me and Sally, and but for her I'd better be a slave and row and galley. But when my 7 long years are out, oh then I'll marry Sally. She is the darling of my heart, and she lives in a alley. love was born in Aberdeen, the bonniest lad that ever was seen. But now he makes our hearts so sad. He takes our field with his white cockade. Oh, he's a ranting, roving lad. He is a brisk and a long lad. Betide what may, I will be wed and follow a boy with a white cockade. I'll sell my rock, my wheel, my tool, my good grey mare, and oak it call, to buy myself a tartan lad, to follow a boy with a white cockade. Oh, he's a ranting, roving lad, he is a brisk and a long lad. Betide what may, I will be wed and follow the boy with a white cockade.